Who here likes losing? Come on, show of hands. Who likes losing? Yeah, didn't really think so. I really don't like to lose. A while ago, this can get me into trouble. A while ago, I played a pretty impressive, creative, practical joke on my friend Luke here, and obviously he then retaliated, and then with another practical joke, and then I retaliated, and then he retaliated, and it spiraled kind of out of control, and neither of us really wants to back down, and we've kind of got to the point where nobody can really go much further because we're kind of at a line that you probably shouldn't cross. Like, nobody likes to lose. The only people that I know who like to lose less than me is possibly my wife, Kate, and her family. Like board games on holidays, can all be going well, and then a particularly aggressive move, and all happiness, holidays, and hope for the future kind of hang precariously in the balance as we try and resolve it. Although seeing some of you play with your umpao, gambling over Chinese New Year, I can see there's another group of people who do not like to lose either. No one likes to lose. And there's been a shift in culture as well to try and make it possible for nobody to lose. In the 20s, somebody coined the term a win-win solution. Nobody has to lose. We'll just have a win-win. At university, I had to take a course. There were some subjects that were compulsory, and the grading for them was passed and not passed yet. In other words, you failed. But they were going to give you multiple opportunities to keep taking it, to force you to do it until you're a winner. There's also been research recently, I saw this in the newspaper last week, saying that in any given population, when it comes to democratic elections, that there's quite a large contingent that simply vote not for who they think will be the best leader, but they just vote for who they think will win. Because nobody likes to back a losing horse. Nobody likes to lose. We're in the season of Lent at the moment, as Miles spoke about last week. Traditionally, Lent is the 40 days that lead up to Easter, where we celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus. And traditionally, it's a time that Christians would take as a time to set aside some time for fasting, for prayer, to kind of identify with what Jesus has done for us. Unfortunately, this year it's coincided with Chinese New Year and the beginning of 15 days of feasting festivities and so on, but we can work with that. But if you think about it, there's this season of Lent where you kind of, you give up things, you lose out on things. But if we're honest, so much of the Christian life is like that. So much of following Jesus seems like you choose to lose. It's been said that salvation costs you nothing, but discipleship costs you everything. When you came to Jesus, there was no cost for you. Jesus paid it fully on the cross. But your discipleship, it's not that Jesus will take everything, but it's like that everything is up for grabs. It's like when a couple first have a child. It's like the child won't ruin everything, but you never know what it will change. It's cost you in small ways, in big ways. It's cost you your second lion of the weekend. It's cost you financially as you've given. Maybe it's cost you to maintain your integrity, when you get pulled over, the fine or the penalty, Or I had a friend at uni who would tell Christians that they were losing out because they weren't choosing to pursue the kind of sex life that he was going for. Following Jesus can seem like you choose to lose. And the thing is, Jesus doesn't contradict that. In fact, he affirms it. In our passage today, he affirms it. And this passage is recorded in all four of the Gospels. And it's even repeated twice in Matthew and Luke. It seems to be that the way Jesus understands it, to be a follower of him means that you have to choose to lose. But that there is more than we might first imagine to that. Would you like to turn to our reading for today? This is Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 22. And it will come up on the screens. This is Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 22. It says this: They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man and led him by the hand outside of the village. When he had spat in the man's eyes, as you do, and placed his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, and and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others one of the prophets. But what about you?" Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him to one side and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd along to him, along with the disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for you to gain the whole world, yet forfeit your soul? Or what can you give in exchange for your soul? If any of you are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of you when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels." Amen. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for your word to us. We thank you that you speak plainly because you want us to understand. And so we ask that you'd open our hearts today to receive your word to us. Amen. This is a really strange passage. Jesus is not doing what everyone is expecting him to do. He's kind of not singing the tune that everyone else is singing. Like they're wanting a Messiah, someone who's going to bring them to victory, and he keeps just like kind of dodging out the way. Before this passage, Jesus has just done the feeding of the 4,000. He's done this incredible miracle, this extraordinary sign. Incredible miracle in that it's been practical, it's fed people's hunger, and an amazing sign in that it's pointed to who God is and what he's up to in the world. And he does this sign for them, and then it says the religious guy's response is to come to Jesus and to ask for a sign. And it's recorded, it says that Jesus sighed deeply. It's like, oh gosh, come on guys, are you not listening? And Jesus, they've come to him not because they want to know what God's like, they come because they want to be entertained. And they want to be affirmed in what they believe, what they think about God. And Jesus won't play their game. And so he leaves, he moves away. And then it says he comes to Bethsaida. And it says this crowd bring out this blind man to him. Now we don't know the motive of the crowd in this, but Jesus takes the blind man away from them. He walks the blind man outside of the village and he prays for him. And he says, "How are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I can see a little bit." And so he prays more, which is why in prayer ministry, we keep on praying until we see breakthrough. But he prays for him, and his eyes are opened. And then he says to him, "Look, don't go into the village. Don't go back to the crowd. Just go home. Just go home." He's saying, look, this miracle wasn't done because I'm here to entertain people, because I'm here to affirm what they want to be true. I've done this miracle because God loves you, and God cares for you. And you are important to him. And the blind man goes off on his way. And then again, Jesus takes his disciples away from the crowds. He takes them on a walk and he asks them the question, the most important question you can ask or answer. Who do you say that I am? Who do you say that Jesus is? And Peter is like straight in there, straight on the ball, all guns blazing. He's like, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus is like, "Don't tell anyone." And again, this is not what they would have been expecting. They'd have been expecting, once it's like, yeah, Jesus declared his messiahship, it's like, a politician declaring their campaign, that he was going to go around gathering people, go to the hustings, do the debates, gather everyone, build up momentum, set up the revolution and overthrow Rome. That's what they were hoping for a Messiah. And instead, Jesus says, "Shh." And then he starts to teach them. He says, actually, it's kind of like the blind man in the passage. The blind man, he receives a bit of sight, but people look like trees walking around, and then Jesus prays for him more, and he receives his full vision. It's like that with the disciples. They've kind of got it. He's the Messiah. But the picture isn't in focus. What they think the Messiah is going to do is all about them and all about their desires. And Jesus actually says, he wants them to have full vision, full clarity. And so he starts to teach them. He starts to reshape their understanding of the Messiah. He says the Messiah is going to come, and he's not going to come in victory, but he's going to come in weakness. He's not going to come and win over the religious establishment. Actually, he's going to be rejected by all of those in power. The Messiah is going to choose to lose. That's God's plan. And at this, Peter takes Jesus to one side. Peter's like, I love Peter. Peter's like, what Jesus needs is he needs a pep talk. He needs, Peter's like, you're not going to lose because I'm on your team and I'm going to fight for you and I'm going to win it. And so we're all going to win. I kind of think of it, it's like Peter, in a film where it's kind of everything's okay, and then the big game or the big important moment or the big something's about to happen and the team's feeling low. And then one person steps forward and gives the pep talk. And it's kind of like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's that moment in Good Will Hunting. It's the Captain, my Captain moment in Dead Poets Society. It's basically any Robin Williams film. Peter thinks he's Robin Williams in that film, and he's going to give the pep talk, and then Jesus is going to go, actually, yeah, we're going to win, and it's all going to work out. And Jesus, you kind of get the sense that he doesn't want to do this to Peter, because it says he turns and he notices the disciples. Because, Peter's taken him to one side, but not that far away, because a good speech needs a good audience. And so he's taken him to one side, and Jesus goes, well, this is too important to let this slide. And so rebukes Peter and the disciples, in front of the disciples, in the harshest and firmest way. He says, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind God's concerns, but you have the concerns of man. Now notice that he doesn't contradict what Peter said. He doesn't say, actually, no, suffering and death, that's really good. He doesn't say, oh, pain, that's a really positive thing. He just says, it's not that God doesn't care about them. God's not a sadist. He just says that God is not concerned with them. He's saying, Peter, look, you're concerned about the here and the now, the this and the that. Well, actually, the Messiah here is coming to bring all of creation from eternity past to eternity future back into reconciliation with the Father, back into relationship for which it was created, so that you and I could have freedom and forgiveness and joy and salvation and be in perfect relationship with our Father. And Peter, you're worried about whether or not a few religious guys are going to agree with us. And so he rebukes him. He says, God's not concerned with the things that are filling up your mind. And then it's kind of like Jesus kind of feels a preach coming on. So he gathers the crowd. He gathers the crowd and the disciples, and he teaches them, and he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And the crowd are kind of bit like, well, obviously we want to be your disciples. We've followed you into the desert. Obviously we want to be your disciples. You're cool. You do miracles. You give us food. Like, of course we want to follow you. But what do you mean, pick up your cross? That's really weird. That's what the Messiah is here to bring me self-fulfillment, to bring our nation everything that we've been hoping for. What do you mean, pick up your cross? Actually, Jesus, that's a bit offensive. Roger over here, his brother was crucified. You can't just use that term lightly. The cross was an offensive thing. You couldn't talk about the cross in polite company. It was rude. The peace of Rome came through a cross. That if you disagreed with them, they killed you in the most shameful, torturous, and painful way. And they weren't shy about it. After Jerusalem fell, it said that the city ran out of trees for the number of people that they killed in this way. The cross is something you couldn't talk about. It was a horrific thing. It was, the kind of gut reaction you get, the visceral reaction. You're walking along the pavement and you see a dead bird or kind of used toiletries, and it's just that kind of gut reaction. That's what the cross is to this group of people. And this is everything they're wanting to get rid of, overthrow, get rid of Rome. And Jesus, instead of saying to defeat it, is seems to be saying to walk towards it, to embrace it. And the crowd is bewildered. Jesus seems to be saying that he wants them to die. And he is. His point is that Rome is just a drop in the ocean. That Rome, if you defeat Rome, that's just space for another abusive power. That actually he's not come to defeat that immediately, but he's come to deal with the root and the result of the problem. The root and result of sin that affects every area of human life, relationship, and our heart. The line between good and evil runs directly through the human heart. And Jesus is coming on the cross to deal with sin once and for all. To say it is finished. Jesus is preparing them. He's preparing them for his cross and eventually theirs. You know, all of those people who were there that day are now dead. Some died as martyrs, some didn't. But they will have all have had to die to themselves spiritually to carry on following Jesus. They would have all had to die to the need for self-glory, for the world's respect. They would have had to die to their fear of man, for an easy life, the want of earthly wealth. They would have had to die to the desire to save their life. And again, that's not where it ends. This is not just about death, as if death is a good thing. Death is an enemy. This is about death which is defeated by resurrection. Jesus starts by talking about the fact he will be rejected and finishes talking about his coming again in glory. That as we die to ourselves, we will experience resurrection life in the same way as Jesus died to himself and experienced resurrection life. You know, Jesus doesn't say your hunger is wrong. As Miles said last week, it's not that your hunger is wrong. It's that the way you're kind of feeding that appetite, your diet is wrong. There's an amazing line in the film, The Interview, the Seth Rogen film, where somebody says, your Western wars don't work. And his response is, I know, and we will keep fighting until they do. Jesus is saying that. It's like, it's not that what you want is wrong. It's but the way you're getting there won't get you there. The things you're feeding you won't satisfy your hunger. You win by losing. And this shouldn't surprise us. You know, to gain anything significant means losing out on something else. You know, I know we're kind of a generation that's kind of under the illusion you can make a choice without limiting your options. We have FOMO and things like that. But you know, this is obvious to us. You know, look at Olympic medalists, gold Olympic medalists. They are the biggest winners of that day. You know, maybe they set a world record. They are the biggest winner. But way before that, they were the biggest loser. They lost out on way more stuff than we probably lose out. They lost out on late nights, lazy mornings, and fun food. They lost out on so many different things. But you lose on something to gain something of greater significance. Jesus says, deny yourself. Pick up your cross. You win first by losing. So what does this look like? Well, let's think of three characters from the New Testament. You've got Zacchaeus, you've got Mary, and you've got Paul. And denying themselves hits them in the pocket, in their popularity, and in their path. Zacchaeus, he comes to faith in Jesus. He's a tax collector, and he says, the first thing I'm going to do is repay everyone that I stole money from. And I'm going to give them 4 times the amount back. You know, that hit him in his pocket. That cost him a great deal. Mary, when she had the call on her life to carry Jesus, she gave up her popularity. She lived under the rest of her life under the scandal of the ambiguity of Jesus' paternity, out of the scandal of a child conceived out of wedlock. She denied herself and lost her popularity. And Paul, and this is the one that I think is for us today. Imagine Paul. He denied his path. Paul would have spent his whole life preparing to be a rabbi. He says he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was discipled under the great teacher Gamaliel. He was versed in all all different languages. He would have memorized the entire Old Testament, not just the fun memory verses, but the lists and the rules and the genealogies. He knew it all. He could have debated any rabbi in the known world, and God sends him to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, the ones that couldn't care less about the law. He finds himself sent to Ephesus and Corinth, places of such spiritual and sexual darkness that the things he finds himself speaking into, he wouldn't have even been able to speak about without defiling himself before. Peter had to deny himself and give up his path. The punchline of that, obviously, is that the person who does get sent to the Jews is Peter, the fisherman, the uneducated guy, and that's God's divine sense of humor. But do you think either of those people now regret what they gave up? Of course not. Zacchaeus, it hit him in his pocket, but he is now in heaven with Jesus, with greater wealth than he could have ever imagined. We probably all have greater wealth than Zacchaeus could have ever even imagined. If you have a toilet in your house, that probably would have blown his mind. If you have a car, that's probably more money than he could have ever conceived of. Mary, she gave up popularity in her hometown. And she gained status as somebody that we look to, that we admire, that we look towards as somebody who is a symbol and a sign of how we are to live out obedience to Jesus. She had favor with God. And Paul gave up the opportunity to influence a small group of Jewish men to take on a few disciples. And instead, God made him possibly the most influential man in all of history. He's possibly the most influential writer and thinker that has ever graced this planet. He set up this thing called the Hall of Tarsus that sent leaders, male and female, all over the known world, to Asia, to India, to Europe, all over the world. He wrote the letter of Romans, which is possibly the most impacting piece of literature that is in existence. He gave up something smaller to gain something greater. He chose to lose. And the thing is, in that moment, it would have felt like losing. It still would have felt like losing, probably up to the point he died. This book of Romans, this incredible piece of literature and theology and just amazing, just brilliance. It was written to probably a group of 40 people. Paul probably would have died before he knew the impact that he was going to have. It would have felt like losing, but it wasn't. I had some friends. I had a friend who trained with me at theology college, and he took an 80% pay cut to go and train for ministry. That would have felt like losing. I had another friend, a guy called Alex, and he came to work with us, and he was kind of on our team, and I was looking after him, and he's an amazing photographer. And the Lord said to him that he should come off social media. Nothing wrong with social media, but he just felt that the Lord was saying, come off it. He said, I don't know if it's forever or just for a season, but that's what the Lord said to me. And I was kind of like, really? Like, you're a photographer. You're like a young guy. You're a media manager for a start. You kind of need to be on social media. But he was like, no, this is what the Lord has said, and he came off it. A few months later, he just said, actually, the Lord's now said I can go back onto social media. So he reopened his accounts and went on. About 5 months, just before we left to come here, Instagram made him a featured user. He has 27,000 followers. Doors have opened up to him all over London in the music world. He's now a person of influence, and he's a light for the gospel in those areas. Now, I can't prove to you that was a reward for his obedience. But what I can say, I do know that what God did in that season in his heart, I do think it was a reward for his obedience. But more importantly, what God did in his heart in that season has prepared him to receive in a greater way the greater reward he now has. He gave up something small, and he has gained something greater. And it's hard, isn't it? It seems like losing at the time. It can feel like losing for a long time. And it's hard. There's a few reasons it's hard. First of all, you have to trust, even when you can't see it, that what you're giving up is not as great as what you will gain. You also have to trust that God is no man's debtor. And that's the faith we hold, and that's the promise of God. That is the promise that we find in this passage, and that is what the witness of the church has been for 2,000 years. That as you choose to lose, you'll find that this is the path to life in all of its fullness. And also, I've kind of set it up as an option, but it isn't really. It isn't really. Jesus says this: if you hold on to your life, you will lose it. If you let go, you will gain it. At the end of our lives, all the toys go back in the box. You know, we came into this world with nothing, we leave with nothing. The choice is not, will you choose to lose? The choice is, what will you choose to lose? Will you lose something greater or something lesser? And I said this a few weeks ago, you know, the gospel doesn't mean that you get to decide whether or not you die. The gospel means that you get to decide when you die. And those that practice dying to themselves every day find that their actual death comes a lot easier. Those that practice forgiveness every day find that when something really hurtful and hard happens to you, they find that forgiveness comes a lot easier. Those who practice patience and kindness will find that when somebody really doesn't deserve patience or your kindness, that you'll find it a lot easier to give if you practice dying to yourself each day. And forgiveness is possibly one of the most clearest examples of you lose one way or you lose the other. When somebody hurts you, you either choose to lose by forgiving them. You choose to give up your right for vengeance, to be the judge, to be paid back, and you forgive them. You lose that way. Or you lose by holding on to that unforgiveness. And that hits you in two ways. You lose out in this way. Firstly, because when you don't forgive somebody, actually the impact is greater on you. It's been said that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. The impact of unforgiveness is greater on you than the object of your forgiveness. But also, as you withhold forgiveness from other people, you stop yourself from receiving it from God. The Lord's Prayer says, forgive us our sins as we forgive others. You can't walk into God's kingdom whilst actively pushing other people out. We receive as we give. You know, following Jesus daily is daily choosing to deny ourselves. Jesus here is preparing his disciples for those that will have to pay the ultimate cost, that will have to die for their belief in Jesus. And that still happens today. We saw the Egyptians, 20 of them last week, murdered for their faith in Jesus. But sometimes that can seem so far away from us that we struggle to apply this. Jesus elsewhere, when he reiterates this, says, pick up your cross daily. This is about being prepared to die for your faith in Jesus, but it's also about dying to yourself daily in the private and in the personal and in the small. And this is important because it's the private and the personal and the small that stops us from becoming overrated. You know, it's been said that our generation could possibly be the most overrated generation in the history of mankind because we have so much opportunity, but are we going to do anything with it? The writer Shane Claiborne said this. He said, it can be fashionable to talk about the poor, but not as fashionable to talk to the poor. It may be popular to talk about justice, but not know any victims of injustice. We will never make poverty history until we make it personal. Dying to yourself in private stops us being so occupied with the millions that we forget to learn the names of our neighbors. You know, dying to yourself daily in the small private things is where there is great grace to be found. That's the challenge for me reading this. That Jesus took that guy, the blind guy, out of the village. There's great grace to be found in your private devotion, just with you and Jesus. And you don't need to tell anybody about it straight away. There's great grace for us to be had in the private, in the personal, in the devotional, in the simple, as we deny ourselves daily. Pick up our cross and follow him. And that's what will change the world. Because this didn't start with millions. It started with the 12. It didn't start in a mega city. It started outside of a village. And it didn't start with a victory. It started with Jesus dying on a cross. I love the story that Philip Yancey tells of a South African woman of mixed race called Joanna Flanders Thomas. She, as a student, had kind of participated in anti-apartheid demonstrations, and after apartheid fell across the nation, she just focused on local problems. And she turned her attention to one of the most violent prisons in all of South Africa that was nearby. Nelson Mandela had spent 8 years there. And what she did was she visited the prisoners daily. And she brought to them a simple message of forgiveness and reconciliation. She earned their trust. She listened to their stories. She heard about their abusive childhoods and their upbringings. And she tried to show them a different way to resolve conflicts. Forgiveness. To choose to lose. Before her visits, it was recorded that there were 279 acts of violence against guards and prisoners in the previous year. The year after her visits, there were 2. It's the small things. It's the small dying to yourself that as you die to yourself, Jesus promises to breathe resurrection life back into you. As we follow in his footsteps, as he died physically and was raised to life physically, as we will, who believe and follow him, when we die, as we do that daily in the spiritual, we experience spiritual resurrection life in our daily lives. You know, Jesus invites us to deny ourselves in our pocket, in our popularity, and in our path. And I really think the path is the one that's for us today. And not just for our paths, but also the path for the people we care about. You know, your spouse or your children or your friends, and you have great aspirations, but maybe those aren't the aspirations that the Lord has for them. Jesus invites us to deny ourselves, to pick up our cross and follow him. And he doesn't ask us to do anything that he has not already done for us, he has not done greater than us, and he is not willing to do for us again and again and again. You know, before the cross, Jesus prayed to his Father and said, "Is there any other way?" And the answer was no. So Jesus went to the cross and he gave himself fully. He gave everything he had for us. He denied himself in every possible way for us. And Paul later writes that the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. He died on the cross so that you could have forgiveness, that you could have freedom, that you could know that the past is forgiven, you could know him in the present, and you could have hope for the future. Not pie in the sky when you die, but real hope for a real future here, of joy, of happiness, of reconciliation with one another and with your Father in heaven. Jesus says, "Come and follow me. I've done it. I've set you free. In the power of the Spirit, you can choose to lose." And that is the path to receiving life in all of its fullness.